some people know about the Canadian Clock Museum because we've had thousands and thousands of people that have contacted the museum through our website. We've been online since 2001, and the museum opened in 2000. The picture you're seeing there basically on our website is when the building and the lawns were in better shape, but was the Calvary Pentecostal Church, which the museum moved into in March 1st of 2000. And the collection is based on one that I put together starting in the 1980s. We're set up as a nonprofit Canadian company, incorporated in 1999 December. And since our official opening to the public in May of 2000, we've had more than 15,000 physical visitors. And since just over a year ago, when we actually put the link, which I'll show you in a moment, on our homepage that you can take a virtual tour, that tour apparently has been clicked on by more than 50,000 people in just over a year. So being on the internet certainly helps. And several times a week, the museum gets requests through our website, questions that come in by email from people who find or inherit Canadian clocks or other clocks as well. So I spend some of my time just replying to clock questions. One came in this morning about a Canadian clock. Somebody was asking about the details on it. So basically, our focus is 2 centuries of clocks. So we do have Canadian label clocks from the 1820s on up, and I will start with those in a moment. Visitors here often leave saying they are surprised at the number of companies that actually made clocks in Canada. A fair number made cases even in the 20th century and put imported movements in, but surprising number that I'll focus on actually made everything, the cases and the movements, in Canada. And that wasn't just in the 1900s, it goes back to the 1870s. Now, we do get requests. People who come in, people of all ages, kids, they want to know the oldest clocks we've got. So if you take the virtual tour and click on it, this is what happens. You end up facing into the upper level of the museum. Again, it was a church, Cornerstone, 1962. You can use your mouse, rotate around, and zoom in as well. So this is from the upper level looking down to the front door, which is down here. And people come in and they've got to come upstairs. We don't have elevators, so we do have 9 steps that come up. And we have chairs that people can sit down in. We sometimes help people up with wheelchairs as well. I'll say more about these clocks later, but Starburst, 1960s and 70s, that's the sort of thing that prices have gone crazy high. They've gone up by a factor of 10 sometimes in what they're asking for that sort of thing. So I'll say more about those later, but what we've got and what you can do in the lower, I've just clicked on it as a floor plan that shows from the top looking down the various sections in the museum. So I'm going to start over in the back corner over here and look at some of our oldest clocks. So does anybody recognize this style of clock? That essentially is 200 years old. It's called a pillar and scroll style of shelf clock. It's got a wooden case. It's got a hand-painted wooden dial here. Behind that hand-painted wooden dial is a wooden movement made out of wooden plates and wooden gears. They would have come up from a factory in Connecticut that was making those back in the 1820s. But this has a Nova Scotia label in it. So that's our oldest Canadian label clock. Often the labels will say on this sort of thing, made in Canada. There's no way to ever know. I sometimes joke I'd like to go back in time and talk to people 100 and 200 years ago. But the probability is that the whole clock was imported and then a Canadian label put on it. So that's 1820s. Another one of the old ones in our collection is this one. That's 1820s or 1830s, Nova Scotia label, very fancy case with stenciling on the half columns here. And the wooden piece across the top, horizontal piece, is called the splat on a clock. Again, it's a hand-painted wooden dial. You put a crank key in and wind up the cast iron weights every day pendulum clock. Now, if we come around to these two, the one on the left, that was your 1830s. The other shelf clock, 1820s. This is 1830s. Mass-produced style of shelf clock. This has its original mirror down here, wooden movement, hand-painted original, the half columns and the splat at the top. That's a Nova Scotia label as well, Annapolis Valley. So very early, basically 190 years old. The Americans didn't have sheet brass to make their own parts, stamp out parts for brass movements until the 1840s. So if you go back to the 1820s and earlier, anybody in the States, Eastern North America, who wanted a brass movement clock made, the brass came from England. It was very expensive and hard to get. So the Americans were using wood. By the 1840s, you did have brass available finally, the brass rolling mills in Connecticut, and they could stamp out the parts. And of course, from that point of view, the general shapes of wheels and the pinions and everything that make everything go were known well over 100 years before that. So just a matter of setting them up to stamp them out of brass. The same as the clock that Steve showed earlier with the Waterbury, Connecticut label on, that's in your museum there. This actually has an OG style case, refers to the cross section of the wood through here, and that's typical of wood veneer on a cheaper wood. And if I look up here, you see a small chip of the veneer under there. You may well find an old OG clock out of a barn where most of the veneer is coming off, peeling off because of humidity and temperature. So you will see sometimes veneer cracks, but that's okay. Question of what the wood is, that's always people wondering what kind of wood was used. Sometimes it looks like cherry wood or a very rosewood, for example. In fact, Seth Thomas later in the mid-1800s used rosewood. The problem is, don't think about what kind of an expensive wood you're talking about today. Talk about wood that was available back then, and cherry was a very common wood that was used. So if I back out, and again, when you're doing the virtual tour, you will see rings on the floor. There's something like close to 20 different locations where the tripod was set up. A couple of young guys in Deep River just over a year ago with a camera system, quite inexpensive, from California. It does a 360-degree rotation controlled by an iPad. And it's not video, it's high definition digital images stitched together. So if I click on this one, what I want to come over and look at, whoops. Can I move that out of the way again? What I want to do is look at these. So you might think and call those grandfather clocks. The term grandfather clock for a clock based on the floor didn't come along until the 1870s. Some of you know that song that talked about a clock that stopped when grandfather died. That was published around 1876. Shortly afterwards, what were originally called tall case, long case clocks like these were actually renamed in the advertising grandfather clocks, and that's the term we know today. So when I showed you an 1820s shelf clock, this was, if you could afford it, and these were low-end clocks compared to fancy brass movement ones from England, but this sort of fabulous looking clock is actually 200 years old. It's in extremely good condition for the case. Montreal, Lower Canada, and the initial I and Twist. Ira Twist was one of several Twist brothers, came up from Connecticut, built a factory to make the wooden cases in Montreal in the 1820s, 200 years ago. Wooden movements, such as the one on the shelf down here, were brought in from Connecticut. The plates are made out of oak before brass, and the wheels and the pinions are all made out of cherry wood. It's a fine grained fruit wood. And the weights for these, you open the door and crank them up, wind them up by hand every day, pull them up every day because they're metal cans with scrap metal inside. So this gorgeous case, and I sometimes tease visitors and ask them what kind of wood it is, because these in fact were made out of pine and they were all hand painted. Now, the original painting on this from 200 years ago is in surprisingly good condition. Sometimes they will be well aged, and worst case scenario, you might find a twist clock where the paint's been stripped off and that really affects its value. If you find one of these today, insurance replacement value would be somewhere around $4,000 or $5,000. That's cheaper than the $10,000 that would have been 15 years ago. The hand-painted wooden dial looks rather impressive. And you can see right here and here where you put the key in to wind up the weights every day. As I mentioned earlier, you can't do that. Those are fake. That's part of the painted design. If you find a twist or equivalent company clock, you had to literally open the door down here every day and pull up the weights. So another extremely rare clock, the one that we've got, if I can back out enough on this, from the side, you will see it here. That's also 1820s. It's got a dark finish on pine wood, and it's got a wooden movement that runs for a week, not a day. What I'm going to do is swing out to here and get a better look at that clock. And again, this sort of maneuvering you can do on your own at home. You just won't get the information presented with it as well. So this sort of thing, it does have winding holes, 3 of them. And the information over here that we got in French with it seems to have been written in the 1920s, but the implication is this was actually made as a copy of another clock made by a man named Xavier Clément, 1820s, Montreal, Lower Canada, in fact, north of Montreal, Lower Canada. And he apparently copied somebody else's clock. He made everything out of wood. It's hard to see, but if you're in the museum, you'll see the pictures of some of the sections of the wood movement. It's got, when you pull up the weights that run it for a week, tin can weights, it's got a simple calendar system, and you can set the hands so it shows the number like 14 or 18 within the month, and also the first letter of the day of the week in French. So for Thursday, you've got a J over here for jeudi. So basically, earliest clocks that way. Then I want to go over here. Let's see if I click on that one. And I'll change my mind, come back over to this floor position, because when I mentioned 30-hour wooden movement clocks, weight driven, there's an example of an 1820s, 1830s wooden movement. As I mentioned earlier, now different gearing compared to a grandfather call case clock, but the plates made out of oak, the wheels made out of cherry wood, interchangeable parts, brass only for the escape wheel up here where the most wear would be. And you're talking 1820s, 1830s, that's 100 years before you had electricity for modern factory machinery. So you're talking water wheel driven, belt drive from the ceiling, and later on steam engine driven lathes and all sorts of other things, and no electric light for electricity. So basically, these are quite rare. And if I go back over, it would help if I back out a bit. You go here and swing around again. Got to figure out how to not drag the people off. So these are the 3 that are 1830s, like that Nova Scotia one I showed you earlier. But this is now Upper Canada. The label in here, which is a picture of it on the wall on the left, but that's Dundas, Upper Canada, Dundas near Hamilton, apparently a bigger community than Hamilton back then. As for the Nova Scotia one, you've got a winding holes and a hand-painted wooden dial. This one has a replacement mirror by a previous owner. And below it, this one, in fact, is a Lower Canada label, Stansted LC, Lower Canada, on the Vermont-Quebec border today. And this one is actually a Niagara Falls, Upper Canada, the one down here, and it was restored by a good friend who passed away a few years ago. He was an expert on wooden clocks, wooden shelf clocks, and restored the wood movement. Actually put a new wooden splat in and did the stenciling on everything as well. And I managed to find an old mirror, not that old, but an old mirror that to replace what was in there. So you're talking actually the earliest clocks, Canadian label clocks, both tall case and shelf clocks. What about clocks made in Canada? I mentioned earlier on, it's surprising how many companies actually made clocks in Canada. What we have on this side of this room, in fact, starting on the left over here, on around, and by the way, we do have a few chairs for people to sit on. Usually it's the kids that are sitting down rather than the older folks, but no problem. And so we've got examples of clocks that were made either in Whitby or in Hamilton, Ontario. So if you go over to here, there you are, OG clocks again. So if you're looking for an OG clock in a shop or a flea market or something in your area, you may well find it's an American label, but you might get lucky because these two have Canada Clock Company, Whitby, Ontario. And we can date those to the early 1870s. Weight-driven brass movements crank up the weights every day. And paint the dials, sometimes this one on the left, of course, the dial's in poor condition, so is the design on the glass. But those are characteristic. There is an out-of-print book that you can sometimes find online that talks about the Whitby, the Canada Clock Company Whitby, and then the Hamilton Clock Company in Hamilton, which is a small number of clocks here. And then the final of the 12-year period was 1880 to 1884, where you had back to the Canada Clock Company, now in Hamilton, Ontario. Based on that research in that book, it's known that all of the clock movements and all of the wooden cases were actually made in Canada, made in Whitby or Hamilton. And the styles are similar to what the Americans were doing, so they were competing that way. For instance, this particular example here, it's a mirror side. You've got 45-degree angle mirrors on each side with a cherub here and here, hand stenciled, hand painted wooden glass tablet on the front. Typical 8-day clock, mirror sided as it's called. It's one of 3 models that were made in just that 4-year period, 1880, 1884, in Hamilton, Ontario, by the Canada Clock Company. There were a lot of 8-day models, wind up to springs once a week. There were also 30-hour type ones that were less expensive to make and to buy. Some of you may well recognize that style of clock. It's referred to as a schoolhouse clock. And for whatever reason, that was the style, that shape of wall clock that ended up in most one-room schoolhouses throughout Eastern North America. And you're talking back basically 1870s, right on up into the 1940s, I guess, in a way, when I mentioned Pequegnat clocks in a moment. So if I swing around again, what's fascinating with some of these clocks, these so-called 8-day clocks, or 30-hour clocks, brass movement peddlers brought in. Here's the label, A.H. Brown, Leeds County, Canada West. And we know from information in an excellent book, Early Canadian Timekeepers, it's also out of print. The research indicates that Brown was a peddler in basically the 1850s into the 1860s. So you had peddlers' clocks, both 30-hour and 8-day, in the mid 1800s, and then later in the 1800s, you had those Canadian-made clocks that were common. What I'm going to do is switch over to here, and it's closer to our entrance, but what I want to show you now is something more modern. Have any of you ever come across any of these wall clocks? It says Girotti on the dial, Girotti. Turns out I was able to do enough research, get enough examples, and publish an article in the Bulletin out of Pennsylvania about this company. It was early 1960s, that's early 1960s to the late 1970s. They made a lot of wall models, including presumably to be different from the Starburst. They made a lot of, let's get back. Don't pull your mouse off the table. So basically, the fan-shaped ones, presumably they were designed to be different, but these are all battery operated. You had examples with these wooden panels. And if you actually look closely at the panels, you will see that there are no numbers for the dial, but there are cross-section brass rod sections for the hour markers. And the larger ones are actually on the quarter hours, otherwise smaller ones on the other hours. And these you're going to find, we don't have a complete set yet. I was lucky and found a 1971 catalog, so we know some of the models we don't have yet from that time period. And they actually decided in the later on in the 1970s to switch over, rather than wood panels, they switched over to using a polymer foam. So anytime you find a battery clock like this, Girotti name, the battery movement may have failed, but you can get replacements, no problem. And what's the value today? They're asking maybe $200 plus or minus. So what about clock radios? You'll see surprising number of companies. I keep finding more and more of them that actually made these clock radios in either in Ontario or in Montreal for the Canadian market. They're dated 1950s. Of course, glass tubes, AM stations only. And that's back in the day. You remember your parents or grandparents, you could take the tubes out if the sound got fuzzy. Go to a local drugstore, hardware store where they had a tube tester rig and set the switches, plug the tube into the right socket, and determine whether the tube needed to be replaced or not. So you did your own work that way. What the museum does have, and it's available for people to use, is a reference library here. We have a small table that's usually covered with children's time teaching clocks, but they can be moved out of the way. We have over 600 books on all aspects of clocks, watches, horology. We've got complete books on all the major American companies so that we can answer questions we get from people about that sort of thing. We have some one-of-a-kind clocks, not mass-produced. This example, if anybody knows the term tramp art, that's where men of all ages, apparently with pieces of cigar box wood and a pocket knife or a jackknife, ended up building picture frames, mirror frames, furniture, little shelves, boxes, clock cases. And with all of the notches that are on here and the information we have on this clock, it was made by a man named Harry Sykes in Welland, Ontario in 1935. According to a column that we were able to get from the lady in the Welland newspaper, he actually took him months, and there are almost 1,000 pieces of cigar box wood. He actually carved the wooden roses. It was the 25th anniversary, King George V of England, Silver Jubilee. And that was the purpose he made it. So therefore he's got the animals from around the empire. Unfortunately, and I say unfortunately, they were cast iron and not wood, because part of the history of this clock, he'd actually submitted it to the C&E craft competition in 1935. And it turns out the judge downgraded him somewhat. He got an honorable mention, and the comment was in the column that he didn't carve the animals out of wood, they were made out of metal. So this would have been a 5-star winning project, except he didn't carve the animals out of wood. With the children's time teaching clocks, we have mechanical, all physical ones. We have electronic ones. This one, French and English work on that. When you turn it on and press any of the buttons for the numbers, and the little girl's voice will tell you what the number is, what the shape is, and what the color is. The one back here, which is a bit hard to see, that's all electronic. The digitals failed on the front of it, but a little girl's voice, Kelly, the time teaching clock, she'll tell you what the time is in both French and English based on the position of the hands. So you can actually turn the hands, she'll tell you what the time is. These electronic ones, and that dates probably from the 1990s, there's a quiz function which allows you to turn it to quiz, and she will ask you to set the hands, and she'll give you some time, and you move the hands around, and if you get it right, she'll say great. If not, then she'll tell you what the time you've got, but correct it. And so kids, once we can touch things again during pandemic, of course, these are off limits, but the kids can play with those again. So I want to go back on the floor to here. And you'll see our library. It's filled to the brim with IKEA Billy bookcases with lots of books. Our total library is over 600 books now, and we've also got hundreds of magazines and collectors organization bulletins as well. Again, if you get hooked on watches and clocks, there are organizations in Britain, but for North America, it's the National Association of Watch and Clock Collectors. In Pennsylvania, chapters all over the states, 9 chapters in Canada, including Toronto and the Belleville area, and London and Ottawa, Ontario, for the Ontario Collectors Group. So when I talk about grandfather clocks, we have this sort of thing. The one on the left isn't running. We actually got that a year ago from a couple here in town. It was going to go to the dump if we didn't take it. These sorts of things don't have much value today. This example was made in Waterloo, Ontario in the early 1980s. Henschel was a furniture company there for decades. And like other Ontario furniture companies, they were making cases for imported movements, typically from Germany. So a couple of years ago, the lady on the other side of town here didn't want it. It was her brother's. And I think we gave her a tax receipt for about $700, which we think is generous. But these, talking to visitors again this summer, people downsizing, nobody wants these. So you'll find them listed on Kijiji for $500, $300, $200. Could cost you $1,000 to have it moved by a moving van. People in condos, the younger people today don't have space for that sort of thing. So unfortunately, what I want to do is look around at a somewhat different one. we look at this one. This one is a lot more valuable. That was donated about a year ago now, just before the video, the photography shoot was done. That actually was donated by a lady in Montreal, and it has a significant value to it. What about advertising clocks? Yes, there were companies in Canada that made them. And if I swing around here, this is our area in our museum that shows the advertising clocks. Most of the companies were based in either Toronto, along here. The upper one on the right, that was a Schoenbeck Clock Company in Hamilton, but the rest of these are all Toronto. Whereas on this wall, there were companies in Montreal that made advertising clocks. For example, these two, the round and the square one, you can get English and French advertising on them for the Canadian market with a light bulb behind. They also made large and smaller neon clocks. And that was the Canada Ray Clock Company, funny name, Canada Ray Clock Company in Montreal, early 1940s to the mid 1960s. Now, our earliest, I'm going to go back to this location for the camera. The earliest clocks that we've got from the point of view of advertising are the ones on the left and the right. Both of these actually have paper mache doors. The cases were made in Edward Baird's factory in Montreal back in the late 1880s. There's an American writer who'd actually written a book about the history of the Baird Company because he was just 3 years in Canada in Montreal before he moved to northern New York State. This is, we know, 1888 plus or minus 1 year. This one's be about 1890 plus or minus 1 year. These are pendulum operated wall clocks, spring driven, and the pendulum movement typically came up from Seth Thomas's factory in Connecticut, one of the big companies down there. If you find a Seth Thomas clock movement in something like this and the Edward Baird case, insurance value today, replacement value today is at least $2,500. So this and this, if you find one of these for $300, grab it. Anybody collect Blue Mountain pottery? These are now the known examples of the different models that were sold by Bulova. These are Bulova Caravel model battery wall clocks from the late 60s into the 70s. Blue Mountain pottery and Collingwood actually provided the cases, if you like, what I call the ugly fish. There's the ugly chicken. You had round plate dials and you had these octagonal ones as well. So with the, you can see the classic Blue Mountain pottery colors. So anything like that today, $150 and up, you can find them. So I'm going to go around the corner into this small room, and now we're going to get into more modern sorts of things. We do have various items that are not clocks. If anybody wants to see the pictures later, I can show you. We have Edison phonograph, outside horn cylinder player that works. Also an inside horn one. This is the late 50s into the 60s Toronto Philips black and white television set. So you get talking with visitors about what they or their parents or their grandparents had in the way of a television. Anybody remember TV lamps back then in the 50s so you didn't strain your eyes? Harry Snyder in Toronto, in addition to the other things he was doing in the late 50s, he registered the design for this one and two others. 1957, that's actually got a couple of light bulbs behind that you get a bit of a glow through the translucent material. Model 503 for that one. There were China cased ones as well. And the typical TV lamps, people collect TV lamps, of course. If you go online, there are websites. Perry put a clock in his, including the ones with ceramic. You've got Black Panthers on this one. You've got a horse on that one. And there's another one of his three designs, sort of a squash diamond, I call it. The one here down on the floor is more of a almost an in-car heater style. But those crazy things that used to be $100 maybe 10 years ago, the asking price has gone crazy. The one on the television that I showed you with the turquoise color, and of course pink and turquoise, white, brown, and black for the 1950s. There are a couple of black ones listed for sale online, like the turquoise one on the television set. Are you prepared to pay $1,100 or $1,400? Crazy prices from mid-century modern now. This is a curious one. Most visitors don't remember having this. That's our turquoise version. We also have a pale white, a pale green, and we're missing the shade for a fire engine red telephone with a white speckle. These have got black speckle. It is a lamp, 1960 roughly. It is a clock, electric clock, Schneider, but it is not a working telephone. In the handset, there's a button at this end, and if you hold it up, there's a electric heater that glows orange in there so you can light your cigarette. So it's a three-function piece from the around 1960 as a clock, a lamp, and a cigarette lighter. If that isn't crazy, I don't know what is. What he was also popular for, Schneider, and there's some other companies as well, I guess, in North America, but Harry Schneider had various versions of boats with a clock, such as here. You had horses with a clock and the horseshoe, different colors. You had sort of a gold plated, you had a copper plated, you had nickel plated or chrome plated as well. So there were all sorts of little wind up boudoir clocks with without an alarm built in. For instance, you can use this as a wind up alarm clock as well. So he had all kinds of things like that. Schneider did in the 50s. And you might come across the same sort of thing, but it says Breslin on the dial. So it turns out Breslin Industries in Toronto, they were more lamps and lampshades, but in the 50s, and I think I sort of connect this to black and white cowboys and Indians programs on television, but Breslin also had these horses with a horseshoe. And even sort of a 1930s nude, but this is 1950s. And for Harry Schneider, his version down here, he called it his Golden Goddess. So if you find one of these, and like any of these, if you see the 8 and DAY on the bottom of the dial, it meant it was a balance wheel movement. You'd wind up the spring once a week to keep it going. These sorts of things today may be $150, although I've rarely seen recently that sort of thing. I look online for Schneider all the time, hoping to find ones that we don't have. So what about kitchen clocks? Everybody had a kitchen clock back then. I guess I'm going to have to go at it this way. So kitchen clocks, you had lots of choices. You had Ingram out of the States, Ingram Canadian, they called themselves in Toronto. They made kitchen clocks, electric kitchen clocks like these. A lot of people come in and remember this Daisy model. And you're really talking 1950s up maybe to the 1980s in Toronto. They also made the, come on back, there we are. The kitchen clocks were also made by General Electric in Toronto. So General Electric had factories in Toronto making all sorts of large things, but they were also making electric alarm clocks, kitchen clocks as well. And people will come in and say, oh, our grandmother had that model, a different color. Typically, these are still available for $30 or $40 online if the plastic isn't broken. Sometimes the electric motors fail because, again, these are 1940s and 50s. But for something like this, there are some replacement electric motors if people want to go ahead and try and get one running again. Those are available. People come in and remember clocks in this style as well. This one up here, for example, often called humpback clocks, 2 winding holes. This is 1930s into the mid 50s. It was the last style of mass-produced shelf clock for North America. And these are examples, either Black Forest or Forestville Clock Company in Toronto, imported from Germany before and after the war. But you also had options in Toronto. You had this sort of thing, and if you actually find one of these, this lower pair, and look on the label if it's there, it will say Walter Clocks, W-A-L-T-E-R, and you might see the name Walter on the dial. Turns out that was a man named Walter Stonkus. We've been able to do enough research, publish an article. In the late 30s into the early 50s, he made his own wooden cases in Toronto in his own factory, and put in imported movements, either before the war, British and German movements, after the war, German movements. And if you find one of this sort of style with the removable round back door, that was Walter's own invention. I found any American company, sorry, that made anything like that. So Canadian made cases with imported movements. The upper level up here, Seth Thomas was actually making mantle clocks and wall clocks in the West Clocks factory in Peterborough. The big company that owned West Clocks finally took over Seth Thomas Clocks as well. So in the 40s into the 50s, you had mantle clocks that were being made by them also. This example here has got a 2 winding holes time and strike. You could get the chimes every 15 minutes, typically Westminster chimes. And this one, no winding holes, because several of those models you could get with an electric motor to drive the chimes mechanism and the clock. So no winding holes with an electric motor, and sometimes the electric motor will have now failed. So what I want to do is focus on another major company, and that was Arthur Pequegnat Clock Company. And I'm not sure how many people are aware of that company name. So I'm going to go here. Arthur Pequegnat family, the whole big family, came to Ontario in the 1870s, settled in Berlin, Ontario. The result was, when he started to make clocks, you had, I'll get over to here, one of his wall models. If you look carefully, and I'm often teasing visitors when they come in, says the clock was made in Berlin, Canada. Well, where was Berlin, Canada? More specifically, where was Berlin, Ontario? Some of you would know that because of the First World War, the name of the city of Berlin was changed to Kitchener in 1916. So for Pequegnat, clocks made after 1916 up to about 1941 will say just Canada on the dial, if it's a painted dial, and on the label it will say Kitchener rather than Berlin. So it helps to define the age of a Pequegnat clock if you have no other information on it. The good news about West clocks, by the way, alarm clocks, kitchen clocks, there's a simple date code on them that allows you to determine the year and the month. So if we look in the Pequegnat room here, we've got examples of some of our large collection of these. We're missing only one catalog model, and that was the one that was a black finish on cast iron back in the 1904, the first catalog. So for Pequegnat, you had all kinds of box style originally. That happens to be the Stratford model, and somebody paid extra for mahogany. Mahogany and walnut were optional extras compared to the basic furniture wood back then, which was oak with a golden finish or darker. And you had typically a time and strike movement that you'd wind up the springs once a week. An 8-day movement, as it was called. Some interesting models that were actually what are called arts and crafts, or maybe mission style as well. With the models named after Canadian cities and provinces. This one is the Montreal model. Time and strike, oak with the brass numbers. And an open space down here with a giant pendulum bob. This one's somewhat more rare. This is the St. Thomas model, after St. Thomas, Ontario. Again, with the glass window down here and the brass numbers. Probably $800 to $1,000 replacement value on that today. I should mention, first of all, you've got box style, the same as the Americans were doing. Some of the Pequegnats had the lion's heads and the fancy feet. You get into, that's the early 1900s, you get into the 1920s and 30s. This tambour style, as it was called, became very popular. Oak cases or mahogany cases, time and strike, wind up the springs once a week for the pendulum. And there were something like 17 different models that Pequegnat made in that style. And it was a style that was also made by American companies and European. So a lot of different models. They didn't really do anything because they went out of business around 41. They didn't do much in the way of humpback clocks. This Chester model showed up after the last known catalog in 1928. So this could be late 1930s with the Chester model here. And it's more of a hump, taller with shorter sides, but lots of clocks. The box style clocks are valued today $400, $500, $800. For the Pequegnat tambour, they're more like $200 to $300 if you're lucky. They actually did make grandfather clocks, but Arthur didn't call them grandfather clocks. He called them Hall clocks, Hall. If the label is still inside on the back, the model name isn't there, it's just Hall clock. This one on the left, which is oak, that's the Halifax model. These were weight driven. You'd pull up the weights once a week to run them. You had brass numbers and brass hands on the wood surface. This is a much rarer model. That's the Nelson model, and that happens to be a mahogany version. This is the Leader model, and these are 3 of 7 catalog models at the beginning, and the mottled glass sections in here sometimes get broken and it's tough to find replacements. If we're talking wall clocks, there were various models. I get around to here, back out. You had this one, that's the Moncton, named after Moncton, New Brunswick. It's got 2 winding holes, but it's a time only, and it runs for 15 days. It was a high quality office clock, valued today maybe $1,500. The one on the left over here is the Regina model. It looks a bit like a schoolhouse, but it's got a longer drop at the bottom. Regina model, insurance replacement value today is getting close to $4,000, although you may find one for less. One in the middle here with the hand-carved or molded beaver on the top is referred now as the large beaver. There was one with a smaller half beaver later, but this is an 8-day spring-driven pendulum clock. The movements, all the Pequegnat movements that you see in a clock anywhere were made in Arthur's factory between about 1904 and 1941. He died in 1927. It's suggested the brass shortage of the Second World War actually closed the factory down. As far as the wooden cases are concerned, right up to maybe the late 1920s, the furniture companies in Berlin and Kitchener made the wood cases for him. And then he set up a small factory in Breslau nearby to make cases in the 1920s. So a whole range of Pequegnat clocks, very valuable today, 100% Canadian made. People go crazy collecting them. As far as something that's not a clock, here's an example. That's a 1914 Northern Electric, made in Canada, crank telephone. If I crank the handle on that, visitors start to remember party lines and ringtones and number of people, as many as 10 or 15 families with the same number, and the fun you had trying to get your own call. When you come in to hear things live, we've got working record players. So this is a Columbia phonograph company out of the States, about 1910. It turns out that if you find an outside horn record player, whether it's an Edison for cylinders or a 78th player, the horns were put away inside the cases by about 1915. So an outside horn player such as this, probably $1,000 and up, for instance, for what you would want to see. What we do have are some examples. You could take your music with you. This is an example of a Columbia. This is now 1920, portable. Victor made them as well. This is a heavy suitcase type, wind up the spring and play your 78 records. It's believed now, based on the latest information on the internet, that 100 billion, roughly 100 billion with a B, of these 10-inch 78 hard plastic records were produced between 1900 and 1960. Remember, there was no electricity till the 1920s, no microphones. So all the original recordings were done acoustically and the playback acoustically, which is what this one is. So I swing around finally to click on here. This is an earlier version. We've now replaced it with one that works. The spring broke in this one, but we've got one from about 1905. This is an Edison outside horn. Put the crane on the case and hang the horn in place. Without those, you could carry the thing. It's heavy, but with a handle, you could take it on to a picnic or a friend's house. And this actually plays the 4-minute celluloid plastic records with the helical groove going from one end to the other. And it's an up and down groove played with a smooth diamond. By the 1920s, he also put his horns inside. So this happens to be a floor model, about 1920, Edison cylinders player. And if you open the lid and crank up the spring, it will actually work the horns inside. And with the door down here, you've now got shelves to store your records and notes as well. So it's a cross section of records of all kinds people can listen to. I'm going to go one more time to the floor plan here, because I want to show you one last record player. And it's this guy here. That's as large and heavy as it looks. Somebody paid extra for an electric motor to drive the record inside. It's 1927. It was top of the line Victor Talking Machine Company, head office in New Jersey, but this has got the Montreal factory label. And it plays 78 records with the electric motor rather than the spring. And with the electric motor upgrade, this was over $400 in 1927. For that time, you could actually get a Ford car as well. So it does play records. The sound out of it's incredible. And the result is that people are really surprised and blown away at what you could do with 78 records back then. And we do have a few records we can play. Finally, I'm going to go to the entrance where we started. And we'll do some Starburst, Sunburst clocks. The 9 over the door, West Clocks, Peterborough. So you saw kitchen clocks, they had all kinds of alarm clocks, Big Ben, Baby Ben, and others. But they made these 9 models, and we've got 2 or 3 others as well. That style of wall clock was 1960s and 70s. And what used to be valued at maybe $30 or $40 when I was adding to the collection 15, 20 years ago, asking price online for these now is $150 up to $300. I noticed recently there's one of these examples, the drama model up here. Somebody has one of those for sale if you really want to buy one for $400. So again, mid-century modern's gone crazy as far as pricing of stuff, except nobody wants the Hammond organs, if you like. They're being given away, Hammond organs, except for the jazz version. Left and right, wall to ceiling, 14 feet up. We've got all kinds of different wall models that Harry Snyder was making, pink and turquoise in the 50s. His younger son, Michael, joined him in the 60s, carried on. So in the 60s, there were all kinds of Starburst, Sunburst models, both sides of the walls here. There were some basic frames, and they could mix and match the wood raised, typically walnut, or sometimes looks more like teak. There were some large, that's the largest one here, the Viking ship, large wall panel clocks, usually battery operated, but this one actually has a wind-up spring movement in it. More modern things, this is one perhaps one of Michael Snyder's designs. If you go back to, if I can get back here on the, nope, come on, up there. One last time. Got to get up on the steps. Right there. You should be more smooth when you're doing this at home. But anyhow, turquoise, pink, strange designs, sort of atomic style clocks, they were called, because you've got the nucleus with the 12 electrons around the outside. Very strange designs that Harry was coming up with in the 1950s, including this one. There were various colors, including white, brown, black, turquoise, and pink. We're still looking for the pink, but refused to pay $1,200 the last time I saw one for sale. It's got 12 eyes staring at you. It's an electric wall clock. And they called that the spider model, apparently. So if I end at this point, there's the front door where you come in, and even the back of the door that's locked has got some clocks on it, Snyder clocks. So, and there's the sandwich board you would see out at the edge of the street on James Street, just 30 seconds off the Trans-Canada Highway. So with that, I guess, Steve, I can shut down and maybe take questions.
Looking for more great content like this? Why not check out the Oakville Historical Society's website, YouTube channel, or Facebook and Instagram pages?